You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome to The Open Door, a show based on the words in Revelation, "I have left an open door before you, which no one can close." This is WCAT Radio's longest-running show, which opened the door to the radio station in October 2016. It's currently offered by Jim Hanink, Mario Ramos-Reyes and friends, and remains open to the love of God in its call to build a culture of life and a just social order through the panel's discussion of the Catholic social teaching principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and economic democracy. The Open Door also explores nonviolence, distributism, and communitarianism. So join us at the Open Door, where you too can be part of the conversation.
Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hanink here with fellow panelists Mario Ramos-Reyes and Valerie Niemeyer. Today, we're going to dig deeper into arguments for and against the existence of God. These arguments matter greatly, and we think they have a necessary place in the work of Christian evangelization. Is Christianity true? We confess that it is. But if God doesn't exist, then it is not. Our welcome and returning guest is Patrick Flynn. He's the author of a new book, The Best Argument for God, coming from Sophia Institute Press just this year. He's a writer, podcaster, and a speaker. Flynn lives in Wisconsin with his wife, 5 children, a St. Bernard, and just recently, an Irish wolfhound. Although that report has not been confirmed. He is the host of Philosophy for the People. As always, we begin in prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and enkindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, who have taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that in the same Spirit we may be truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Patrick, we've discussed last episode the problem of evil. Now, do naturalists face what we might term the problem of good? How might a naturalist account for the good that people do?
Yeah, well, great to be back with all of you. Again, it's a joy. I really enjoyed our previous conversation. And it might be helpful to recap a little bit of what I said in response to the problem of evil before we consider whether naturalists have a problem of their own concerning the distribution of suffering and evil, or just accounting for other moral experiences or value in general, the problem of the good, as you said, Jim.
Yes.
And my short answer is yes, they do. But I think it needs to be carefully articulated. So what I claimed in the previous episode is that the theist can meet the evidential problem of evil in 2 ways. The first is by taking back from the naturalist the assumption that naturalism, as a worldview hypothesis run from a principle of indifference, actually sort of constrains the probability space, if you will, adequately to predict a world of suffering at all, let alone this particular distribution of suffering. And my quite provocative but substantial claim is that it does not do so, not at all. And the primary reason is that once you peer under the hood of naturalism and you get into naturalistic philosophies of mind, how naturalists think about the relationship between the mental and the physical, or the physical realm, and the qualitative dimension, the what it is likeness, the feelings aspect, right, of experience, they do not have a good explanation for that realm at all. For the naturalists, they're committed to what's called source physicalism, right? That it's really the sort of underlying physical states that are doing all the functional work that are ultimately selected for by evolutionary processes. And that the mental realm is really what naturalists very often call an epiphenomena. It's something that is itself caused, but causes nothing. It's sort of a residual or foam that sort of floats atop the undercurrent of physics, if you will. Right. Once you recognize this problem, you realize that the feelings aspect, including pain, has no functional role in and of itself to play. And then you're just left with the huge mystery of why it's there at all to begin with, let alone why it's distributed in the ways that it seems to be distributed, and why it seems to harmonize with so many situations or states that seem extremely befitting. Painful situations tend to involve us avoiding harm and stuff like that. That's a remarkable harmony once you understand the sort of mystery that's going on in naturalistic philosophies of mind. So there's a lot of detail to this argument, but fundamentally that's the issue, is that once you take a good hard look at naturalism, you realize it really doesn't have a good explanation for the distribution of suffering in this world at all. In fact, I don't think it has a good explanation for the qualitative dimension, period. But related to the problem of evil, it's that suffering aspect that we're thinking about. So that's one response that theists can and should make. Take it back from the naturalists. Don't concede that they actually have a good explanation for suffering. They don't. Number two is you can issue any sort of theodicy that appeals to you. And a theodicy is a sort of story or narrative that we think flows, hopefully with not a low probability, from the theistic hypothesis that, gives some reasons. And usually I do think it is a collection of reasons, not just one, of why God could be morally justified for allowing a providence of suffering and evil. And we can get into that more if we want, but I think that there's a number of very useful things that can be said there. We don't have to become full skeptical theists. I think we actually can give a fairly robust theodicy. So give a defense of theism and take away from naturalism. All right. And at the end of the day, I think what that does is it actually tips the scales of the problem of evil back in favor of theism. That yes, even as provocative as this sounds to a lot of people, upon substantial consideration, even the suffering of this world is better evidence for the existence of God rather than a way. Why? Because it's more likely to occur if God exists than if God does not exist. So it all comes back to that likelihood comparison, or that ratio between the worldviews, if that makes sense. Now, your question was concerning the problem of the good. How do naturalists make sense of, I guess, goodness in general? Not just good actions, not just saints and stuff like that. I think they certainly struggle with those sort of supererogatory acts that we see. It's hard to give an evolutionary story for great saints like, Mother Teresa and stuff like that. Usually they'll just say it's an evolutionary spandrel, something sort of went haywire or something like that. There's a lot of just so stories that can always be told, right? I don't think they're very good. But putting that aside, I think it's important to realize that the most consistent naturalists, I would argue, are moral anti-realists. They're nihilists. What they claim the moral dimension is really something down on all fours with preferences, opinions, and sentiment, right? That it's not that our moral intuitions or moral judgments aren't sort of tracking or mapping onto anything objective in the sense that it's sort of preference or stance or attitude independent, right? When we make a moral statement, we're really just sort of expressing a sentiment, an opinion, much like we would if we were talking about preferences and flavors of yogurt or something like that. This is the moral anti-realist position. And I think that is the consistent position from a naturalistic perspective. If you're a naturalist and you're committed to things just sort of being explained all the way through some combination of atomic and evolutionary theory, I think the best and most obvious explanation for moral beliefs and attitudes is that they are just programmed beliefs from blind evolutionary forces that help us to procreate and avoid bears. And they're nothing more than that. To make them anything more than that from a naturalistic standpoint would invite a whole lot of extra contrivances and complications into the worldview, which is which is fine, I think, because then it's clear that naturalism is becoming increasingly ad hoc. It's becoming more like a grand metaphysical conspiracy theory, and it's becoming increasingly less believable. This relates to considerations in my book concerning the simplicity of a theory. So I think if naturalists are going to try and keep their theory simple, which they should want to do if they're trying to compete with theism in worldview comparison, they shouldn't try and contrive their theory or add a whole bunch of adjunct hypotheses to try and secure an objective morality. And for people who are unfamiliar with some of these terms, when we say that morality is objective, we mean that it's stance or attitude independent, that I can be wrong in my moral beliefs, right? There's something that grounds moral facts, and I can be right or wrong about them, right? And I can be really not just responsible, but morally culpable for the actions and decisions that I make. That's the common sense view of morality, right? So I think naturalism faces a fundamental problem on this front. They can either go in the anti-realist or nihilistic direction, which I think is the consistent position with naturalism. But then I think its very statement is its own refutation. I mean, clearly, morality is not on all fours with judgments about flavors of yogurt, right? Nobody thinks that way. Nobody talks that way. When we condemn horrifically evil acts, things that are very difficult to contemplate, but not difficult to discover, unfortunately, we're not just talking about preferences and opinions. We think that some things are really right, some things are really wrong, some things are really good, some things are really bad. And we can talk about the different theories that help ground that. I think that there's quite good ones within the theistic worldview. And that's what you need. You need a theory to be able to ground that. So as soon as the naturalist gives that up, I think that they've lost a feature of the world that needs explanation, not elimination. And then to me, you're losing the worldview debate. Or they can contrive their hypothesis, bring in some adjunct hypotheses to try and hold on to an objective moral reality or realm or what have you. But in doing so, their theory is just going to become internally very unlikely. I would like to liken it to a sort of grand metaphysical conspiracy theory. If you've ever seen naturalists try and propose accounts for securing objective morality, they are quite magical and very complicated. But I should acknowledge they are out there. This is something that naturalists do not want to give up, and I would say for good reason. But my proposal is, if you don't want to give up the moral landscape, you should just give up naturalism and go to theism, because it fits really well within that worldview, where it's clearly something that, from a naturalistic starting point, does not fit within a sort of reductionistic, materialistic perspective. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer, but I hope I somewhat started.
Well, let me give you one quick follow-up, and then I'll turn things over to Mario. You're writing an obituary. And it's an obituary for a well-known, distinguished, and some would say dedicated naturalist. Some would even say he or she is a selfless naturalist. Can you, as a naturalist writing the obituary for this outstanding naturalist, put forward any moral judgments about the dearly departed?
Can they? Yes, they can. Will they be meaningful in the sense that we would like to think that they can be from within a naturalistic perspective? My answer is no. I think many naturalists live with a frequent, performance contradiction in their worldview. Many of them are, in their quiet philosophical moments, nihilists, right? But then they go on social media and Twitter and start making all sorts of moral condemnations about things, right? So that, what they say or how they claim they think in their, in their academic moments is often significantly in tension with how they live their lives. Now, granted, a contradiction in performance is not necessarily a contradiction in logic, but I think it's telling to a very particular degree that something's gone a little bit, haywire here with this line of thought.
Perhaps the obituary should simply mention the memorial service.
Or just, I like this person. You can say that as an naturalist, right?
All right, Mario.
Well, it's been a long explanation. I don't know where to start, but when you say, well, here you have this worldview, which is probably is hegemonic in our contemporary world, and we have theism. It seems that, correct me if I'm wrong, that everything begins with what classics call gnoseology or epistemology. I like the term gnoseology. How do we know things? And that in itself relate to metaphysics, how we confront reality. So when you have this world and you have the other world, the theistic world, then you have two worldviews which seems to be incompatible, incommensurable. So no matter how good your argument is, you're not going to persuade any naturalist. You may say, hey, yeah, it's weak, your argument here and there about suffering. They don't care. They will continue to live. And they will continue to have this contradiction because we human beings are very complex creatures.
Right.
Even theists we are very complex creatures. Mm-hmm. Sometimes the cognitive dissonance that is we also have. So all of this lead me to a question. I think, could it be simply that we believe what we choose? We choose to believe such and such for such event that happened in our life, and then start building our ideology. I don't want to say ideology, our worldview, and then from there on try to somehow make it reasonable, even though some explanations are not very good, but still we are there. There is no dialogue between us. I mean, between naturalists and, I don't know how to call it, theists or supernaturalists. So much so that I heard, and I'm not persuaded, but let me ask you whether there is a common ground between the two worlds in a kind of methodological naturalism. Is there such a thing as a way by which we can find a common ground and then we can, I don't know, depart? What do you think about?
Yeah, great question. A lot there. So let's talk about maybe the role of arguments first, because I think you make an excellent point. Arguments are often useful just to show people further implications of positions that they already hold. Right. Now this can do a couple of things, assuming that your argument is a good one. Right. It could, in one sense, cause that person to engage in reasonable belief revision. So say that somebody accepts some of the arguments that I just gave about naturalism and morality, but their commitment to an objective moral realm is stronger to them than their commitment to naturalism, right? And what I've done with the argument is shown that there's at least a tension here, and a pretty strong one, presumably. Just let's grant that, right? I think that's one of the other roles of arguments is to expose a tension. And tension comes in various degrees. The strongest form of tension is if you can draw out an explicit contradiction. That's rare. It's hard to do that, right? But we can show more stronger or less degrees of tension given various commitments through argumentation, right? So in one situation, if somebody is really committed to an objective, morality, but, their commitment is a little bit weaker to their sort of metaphysical foundation, if you will, that might encourage them. That might encourage them to revise their starting point, right? On the other hand, and this is probably more to your point, if somebody is already committed, come hell or high water, to a wider framework, they can just bite the bullet and ride out those implications, right? And, whether or not we think that's ultimately consistent or livable is another discussion. But they can always do that. They can always just say, yeah, I think that naturalism does entail nihilism, so I guess I'm a nihilist now, right? So in that sense, few, if any, philosophical arguments are absolutely compelling, right? I think that the goal of the philosopher, if we're trying to be persuasive, is to do what you mentioned, Mario, is to try and find points of common ground, or at least commitments that seem dear to somebody. And if we're trying to persuade them in a certain direction, use arguments to draw implications that sort of surround those commitments, right? Okay, morality is clearly very important to you. You are committed to objective morality. Let me give you some arguments of why that's in strong tension with these other things you believe, and give you some, hopefully some motivation to revise those beliefs. And in a sense, I think philosophy, very much like my book, is best done through a cumulative effort around cumulative commitments. So to answer your question, it's going to depend on, on the individual, really, and what their commitments are. I think most of the time we can find at least one or two shared commitments, whether it's to morality or the fruitfulness of science or something like that, where the theists can begin to venture different arguments to posit various tensions between what a naturalist holds dear and their wider metaphysical perspective. But at the end of the day, I totally concede your point. If people, for whatever reason, are already committed very strongly to an atheistic paradigm, they could be fully willing to just ride out any and all implications. So philosophy's strong, it's powerful, but it's limited. You can't like armbar somebody right into changing their mind, right? Mm-hmm.
Anscombe says philosophy does not use thumb screws.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, totally. Mm-hmm.
One quick point. I think it's very relevant. I think I was reading this week a few articles. One article about the perennial philosophy, Thomism. And one article was so insightful about this topic, written a few years back by McInerney, not Ralph, his brother, who is already retired. The article was rationalization. He said very close to reading and arguing and proposing argument, we need to examine what rationalization means and how that rationalization play in human way of arguing, because this is all over the place. And in that sense, a lot of this worldview has implication in psychology, in morality, and we need to examine that. Sometimes I believe what I believe because probably there is something there in my psyche that prompt me to believe what I believe. And so it's a little bit complex, and particularly in our world, which is it's a fallen world. Okay.
Yeah.
That's just a side comment.
Well, it's an important one. It's been a while since I looked into the research in this area, but there is a good amount of research on what's called motivated reasoning, right? Which relates exactly to what you're saying, right? People already believe something, they want to believe something, so they engage in motivated reasoning. And there's different mechanisms that have been identified,
right?
Such as selective memory usage, differential stopping. You read only so far until you find confirmation, but then quit if you think you're going to find disconfirmation, all this sort of stuff, right? Now, my big takeaway from when I was looking into that research, because it was concerning to me, right? It's like, wow, like, are we even capable of like actually using reason to adjudicate anything? But what I found anyways is among the researchers who seemed to be most in the know about this is they were not total skeptics. They say, hey, this is a thing, but we shouldn't be totally skeptical. Like, reason is still good. We can still think through things. We just need to be aware of the biases that we all have, and of how we can all be prone to this. And as long as we're just doing the best we can, there's no reason to think that we still can't come to the truth about things. So I found that to be helpful. Ironically, however, I think that there is somebody will have to fact check me on this, but there was something to the effect that the almost the more educated you are, the more susceptible you can be to this. Sort of the paradox of paradoxes, right? The more somebody might be aware that motivated reasoning is a thing, or even talk about it or write about it or research it, they themselves might be increasingly susceptible to actually engage in it. again, I don't think you have to be totally skeptical. It doesn't mean if you have a PhD, you're going to just be a complete ideologue. Of course not, right? But I remember stumbling upon that little tidbit and having a hearty chortle at it, right?
Valerie, please join now.
Sure. This quote in the midst of the conversation came to mind, attributed to Thomas Aquinas, to one who has faith, no explanation is necessary. To one who without faith, no explanation is possible. Which, coming from like the writer of the Summa, I think is kind of interesting. Mm-hmm. Sophistry also came to mind. We don't hear much about sophistry today, but
we hear a lot of it for sure.
Yeah, everywhere.
Exactly. So I'm kind of curious. I'm not being like super formally educated on the notion how that relates, how sophistry relates to rationalization and motivated reasoning, and I'm sure it has a lot to do with it.
Yeah, we could be sophists with ourselves for sure. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. Speaking of kind of beginning from common ground and shared human experience, things that are generally valued by everyone. I mean, we talked about goodness. The other transcendental of beauty comes to mind. And then, so kind of curious, is there a naturalist strategy for explaining the beauty we find both in nature and creation and also in human creativity? How do naturalists come at that? Because at least my cousin, for instance, who I would say is a bit of a naturalist, of all the humans I have walked alongside on this earth, he is one of the most inclined to behold and to wonder at and to appreciate and engage with the beauty in creation. So, what are your thoughts on how naturalists approach beauty?
Yeah. The beauty, even from a Thomistic standpoint, is one that I've spent the least time thinking about, probably because I see how many Thomists are divided on whether that's a transcendental of itself or an emergent one between goodness and truth. But from a naturalist perspective, it's really not totally, or at least structurally different from how they try to explain everything else. That there's got to be some sort of evolutionary story here to tell, right? And I think that once it's always a matter of, well, give me the details, right? And they're always exceedingly sparse, especially when trying to accommodate an exceedingly complex, curious phenomena that seems to far outreach any mere survival utility, right? And in some cases, it seems like it might be quite disadvantageous for just all in beauty, and then I get hit by a bus, right? So no, there's always a just so story, but I'd say that's just sort of all that it is, right? But again, if you go back to some of those, I think, deeper issues within naturalism that are much more fundamental, which is giving an explanation for a qualitative dimension at all, the conscious dimension. I think the naturalist has run out of gas there, and of course, the things that we're considering are logically posterior to that, right? So to me, like, the naturalist is already sort of out of the worldview race when we're just talking about the emergence of consciousness or rationality in general, let alone all the stuff that is fed to us through conscious experience. Not just beauty, I guess it would be an aspect of beauty, but music as well is something that I've always found impressively resistant to even the most, fanciful naturalistic just so stories. But I mean, I don't want to be totally unfair. There are those stories out there, and that's fair. A narrative a theory really is just a narrative. It's a story that's supposed to wrap around data, and then people will just have to compare those narratives and stories, right? And try and do so while keeping in mind what would actually be consistent with their wider worldview. So yeah, I'm not a huge help on the beauty thing because it's not an area of specialization for me. But that is something where if you have a naturalist friend that is committed to objective beauty, they think, no, there really is some real difference between what the dog left on the street and the Grand Canyon, right? This is not just a mere preference of mine. And if you prefer the former to the latter, like, I can say you're really wrong, right? In the same sense that you can be wrong about certain moral judgment or something like that. If they're committed to that, I think that there'd be a rich avenue of explanation there of how that commitment would certainly better fit with a theistic worldview than a naturalistic one, for sure, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we keep using the word worldview, and so again, defining our terms. What is a worldview exactly?
Yeah, good. That is an important one. So a worldview is just sort of a big picture theory of everything. It's a philosophical big picture. And a worldview is sort of an examination of what is, at least when I talk about worldview comparison in my book, we're talking about what is your sort of fundamental theory of everything, right? And not just physics, obviously not. It's expanded beyond that, but from the grandest possible scheme, the philosophical perspective. So just to give the two representative examples, the classical theistic worldview is that the root of reality is a principle of pure perfection, a being that is qualitatively unrestricted, absolutely simple, eternal, omnipotent, omniscient, pure goodness itself, whose essence just is its existence, God, right? And that is the root that is meant to explain everything else, right? Whereas the naturalistic worldview, and I think in its simplest and best expression, is a principle of indifference of whatever else is at the root of reality for a naturalist. It is not a minded thing, even analogously. It's not an entity that is in any way benevolent or malevolent. It's not directed at anything. It's not aiming at any particular outcomes. And it doesn't have any of the sort of supreme great making properties that the classical theist would be committed to. And I think it is also important that even for my book, I assume the useful falsehood that these worldviews form a neat partition. They don't. There's other options out there. I think that they're the most plausible contenders for sure, but they don't exhaust the space of possibility when it comes to different worldviews. So,
thank you.
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Let's take a look at Pascal. Recently, Pope Francis did. I haven't seen much discussion of his letter, and I did note that in his letter, he doesn't make any reference to Pascal's wager. I wonder, there is a link here with worldview talk. Somebody might say, gosh, now I know there are these two worldviews. Which one should I bet on?
Yeah, good. Okay, so people who aren't familiar with Pascalian wagering, the idea is something like this, right? That it in simplified cartoon form, and then I'll give what I think is the better way of thinking about it. That, hey, because Christianity specifically offers so many upsides and so few downsides compared to atheism, you should just go with that, right? Okay, so that's the cartoon version, but here's how I think it should be better presented, because that version's open to a lot of different objections, and some of them I think are pretty good. So here's where I think Pascal's wager comes in. It comes in only at a certain point and only under certain considerations and qualifications, right? So the idea is you've been working hard. You've been trying to get your worldview straight. You've been thinking about it, and the arguments have brought you to this particular place. You think that it's a 50% chance that Christianity is true, and it's a 50% chance that atheism is true. You've kind of ruled out all the other ones. So you've done the best work you can. You've really tried to adjudicate it, and this is where you are. 50-50 Christianity or atheism. What Pascal's wager then does is it comes in largely from practical considerations and says this. Well, look, if you decide to at least pursue a life of religious seeking, you stand to gain a whole lot and seem to have pretty much nothing to lose. You stand to form a deeper, intimate friendship with God, which of course will facilitate enormous goods, not just in your life now, but in the life to come. If the Christian worldview is true, then this is a sort of life that promotes overall flourishing, excellence, happiness in general. But here's the other cool thing. Since Pascal's time, we also have a lot of, I think, pretty decent sociological research that show that people who live a sort of religious and spiritual mode of life are overall better in this world, not even considering the next one, right? Lower levels of anxiety, of depression, of substance abuse, all the things that we think are kind of negative, right, for obvious reasons, tend to have less instances among people who live a religious and spiritual life. And I don't think it's just a matter of I think the causal directionality of this is in favor of Pascal, not against. It's not that just happier people tend to go and be religious. It's actually becoming religious and spiritual actually does tend to make you happier as well. So it seems like a whole lot of upsides, right? But if you're wrong and you die, then you'll never know. So you don't really lose out on much, right? On the other hand, if Christianity is true and you go with atheism, it seems like you have a lot to lose. You could lose out on that eternal friendship with God. You could live a life that is very sinful, which is a life of really objective failure, of not flourishing. And it seems like you could be more likely to just, suffer from all these other negative consequences that there are just far higher incident rates of among people who do not live a religious and spiritual life. So when you kind of weigh it all up, the idea is the practical considerations overwhelmingly favor a pursuit of a religious mode of life. Now, I say that importantly because sometimes people take Pascal's wager and say, well, you should just believe Christianity. And that kind of brings us back to what Mario says. Can we just choose to believe something? That's an interesting question, but I would just say to put it aside. Rather, I would frame Pascal's wager as pursue a life of religious seeking, right? What does that mean? Go to Bible study, read religious texts, right? Synod at Mass, join RCIA, get around other religious people, pray even the agnostic's prayer. You know, God, if I have a soul, God, if there is a God, save my soul if I have a soul, right? Open yourself up as best as you can to receive the graces of the Lord and surround yourself in religious community and then just let it go from there. So totally circumventing this issue of whether you can kind of just like manually control your beliefs or not. So those would be my sort of modifications and qualifications to Pascal's wager. I think it can play a very powerful role, but it's at a particular point in somebody's journey, if you will, right? Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Mario.
But that explanation...
Pero, sed contra.
Sed contra. But that explanation, when you say, okay, this is the good that you get because you choose to be Christian, you're going to have less depression and so on and so forth. And you're going to have more fulfilled, a life more fulfilled, etc., etc. On the other hand, if you are not, then you may suffer X, Y, or Z. But that explanation in itself entails that you already have an interpretation of what a Christian life is or what a naturalist life is. Because if I ask my friend a naturalist, he would say the opposite. Hey, I'm living my dream now. I'm doing whatever I want. I have pleasure, and I'm also successful in my job, and I don't care much. I try to avoid not to violate the law, but other than that, I'm trying to do my best, and I'm very happy, and I don't have all these constraints that you have, Christian have, and so on. So he may have a different view of what a Christian life is, and so if that then is the case, they say, well, I'm not sure about the next life. I'm going to enjoy this life, and that's it. And he's going to listen to me. And so it seems to me when you are proposing that I'm going to choose the Christian life because here is everything that is good and even the consequences in my psychology, my well-being, and so on. But it's not always the case.
Right.
We can give 100,000 examples of a family who is very faithful is suffering miserably. And then you have people who are not practicing much, and it seems that their life is prosperous.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I'd want to say a few things about that. One is always that exceptions don't prove the rule, right? And that we actually do have good empirical evidence that if you live a certain life, you will have a state of life generally that most people would agree on is the state of life they would prefer to live, right? Less instances of mental health issues, heart disease, even, right? Mm-hmm.
Just one point.
Yeah.
To relate Christian life to mental health, I don't think it's appropriate, because you can have neurotic saints. You can have people who are very good, holy, and they are depressed.
Yes.
People who has been practicing and commit suicide. So that is a very delicate issue.
It is. Now let me qualify. What I'm saying. Pascal's wager is practical considerations for most people. I am not saying that the Christian hierarchy of values is the good life is marked by an absence of anxiety. If it is, then I don't meet it, right? The Christian life is marked by one thing and one thing only. Your objective flourishing is, do you get to heaven or do you not, right? The Christian worldview on the whole hierarchy, if you will, is actually pretty black and white, right? You either succeed in life or you don't by whether or not you find friendship and union with God. That's it, right? But there are other considerations concerning human flourishing and human flourishing that are certainly relevant, that most people still think are obvious and worth having as much as insofar as it does not interfere with, for the Christian, that ultimate good, which is us. And we know that God allows a lot of suffering. This goes back to the problem of evil, because it might be the best or only available means to make sure that we avoid the worst possible outcome, which is hell, and subsequently get the best possible outcome, right? And that's one of the justifications for the problem of evil, is that God will give us that thorn in the side if it is the best or only available means to help us avoid really the worst possible thing, right? Which is that eternal separation from God. So there's no disagreement there. This is really a Pascal's wager. This is one of the reasons I don't even use it in my book. Like, this isn't even in my book at all. I don't find it, I don't find it the most persuasive, but you wanted me to give like the best version of it that I could. I'm trying to do that right now. It's what is going to be generally persuasive to somebody. And look, I was in this position, right? I was somebody who was a naturalist for many years. And let me tell you, if you would have asked me on the face, are you living the best possible life? I had the Porsche at 26. I was running my own business quite successfully. I had a number of books published, but I was really empty, right? So I was a materialist from two perspectives. From the perspective of, I thought that like materialism as a worldview was true. And I thought that if I just got more material stuff, I would be happy, right? So appearances aren't everything, right? And if you would have presented Pascal's wager, yeah, maybe I would have gave you some lip service about I'm enjoying my best life. I wasn't, believe me, because look where I am now, right? Lots, and my family itself is riddled with mental health, especially anxiety. So I'm acutely aware to that. But I would also argue that suffering and mental health issues are not incompatible with joy. Certainly not for the Christian at all, right? Becoming Catholic and Christian has not alleviated my issues, but it's given me a perspective and state of being where it is somehow in a mysterious but profound way compatible with a much deeper inner tranquility and joy, despite the persistence of those sufferings, and seeing the greater, I think, true meaning and blessing that those proverbial thorns in the side have actually given me. So, Mario, your point is actually a very good one. So it's just a matter of contextualizing, like, who are we giving Pascal's wager to? Are we just giving it to that naturalist who is trying to evaluate between, you're right, incommensurable paradigms? So we got to find some common ground, right, of what's going to be appealing to people. But at the end of the day, it is very important to keep in mind that the true life of Christian flourishing, and I don't think this should be controversial at all, is marked by the state we attain in the hereafter. We are either united to the Godhead, and God became man so that we might become gods. That is our ultimate end. That is our ultimate excellence and point of flourishing. And God's going to do whatever He can to bring us there in accord with our finite, fallible, free nature, right? Which for all of us is going to include a providence of suffering at the end of the day. Whereas what is the ultimate good for the naturalist? That sort of circles us back to, well, does that even make sense on a naturalistic paradigm? And ultimately, I don't think it does. I think it's just, well, what do they want? What do they want right now? And that's where these sort of Pascalian things could be somewhat helpful to at least disposing them or opening them up to considering the religious perspective, because most of them want right now not to feel the way that they feel right now, right? And that's about as far as I'd want to take Pascal's wager. I I almost never use it in any of my own work because of these inherent complications. But I will say that even at a point in my own journey, it did kind of, even in the back of my mind, it played some sort of role for me, if that makes sense. Now, at the same time, I wasn't like 50-50. Once I started to see I think the full picture, I don't know exactly the weighting of the scales, but it was very significantly in favor of theism. But those things were still certainly in the back of my mind to whatever degree. So I don't use it a whole lot myself. At the same time, I don't think it's something that we should completely ignore either, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm.
Now, in order to fight anxiety, I never wear a watch.
Smart.
So, Mario, how far are we into the program?
We still have 12 minutes.
All right, let's go. I have a few assorted thoughts. Thought number one, this far into the program, we have not mentioned Jacques Maritain. Now,
Is that customary for this program?
Oh, well.
No, this is dogmatic.
Well, I'm quite a fan of
all right, now,
so yeah.
Mario, though, has mentioned metaphysics, and Jacques Maritain tells us that no one is a metaphysician who has not had an intuition of being. And this intuition is not some sort of emotional function. It's an intellectual function. Now, when we talk about intuition of being, we are then talking about an intellectual vision. And that takes us to the notion of a worldview, vision. Very often, it seems to me that people lose sight in talking about worldviews. They lose sight of what a theory is supposed to be. A theory is not supposed to be a set of propositions. A theory is supposed to be a theorein, classical Greek, a vision. Now, it seems to me an everyday, ordinary analogy is useful here. You're wearing glasses. I'm wearing glasses. Valerie's wearing glasses. I don't know what. Yes, even Mario. Now, what we see around us is certainly mediated by our glasses. And yet, quite rationally, we sometimes realize we need to change the prescription. Which means, among other things, we can take our glasses on and put them off, and we can take our glasses off and put on glasses that we had 10 years ago, if we still have them. So it seems to me a fundamental to a realist view of reality and to a realist anthropology is that we're not locked into a worldview. We can realize limitations of our worldview, and we can do that because we have a fundamental, deep capacity for reason, which brings with it a fundamental vision that allows us to correct our course. And because of that, I think that philosophy has a great deal to contribute. These arguments matter, and they can be presented in popular terms and technical terms, but they matter immensely. And I think one of the problems with evangelization, and it's been already 2 or 3 years since I've been in graduate school. One of the problems that I experienced in graduate school is there are a whole lot of Christians that really weren't intellectually attuned. They heard an argument, they caved. And I think it's very important that you're doing the kind of work you're doing.
Well, thank you, Jim. I do as well for many reasons. One is I think that there are a lot of people like me out there, and by that I mean my former self, of somebody who had a particular set of glasses on, a naturalistic pair, if you will, but still held very firmly a lot of commitments that I increasingly saw were just inconsistent with the frame that I had on, right? Everything from moral responsibility to rationality, human freedom, free will was another one. And I was in one of those positions where those commitments to me, many of them anyways, were stronger and more obvious to me than my commitment to a particular frame or pair of glasses, right? But what I had not encountered were good arguments for the theistic perspective. I was completely ignorant of them. So really what happened is it was this very gradual process where my glasses sort of broke, and then nobody walks around without any vision or frame on whatsoever. But I guess I came as close as you could for a while. I just I threw my hands up and said, I don't know what's true. I'm pretty sure that ain't it, right? But I'm going to try and find the right pair of glasses, something that will allow me to not just explain, but unify, right? That's what we want. We don't just want disparate explanations. We want a really grand unifying theory as well. I think that's one of the things we're looking for when trying to satisfy this theoretical virtue of simplicity. Does our theory unify, right? That's to me, that's actually pretty critical. Mm. And it was through certainly a number of pagan thinkers, but ultimately getting up to not just Thomas himself, but many Thomists like Maritain. I was looking around. I usually actually have degrees of knowledge in this room. It's not here right now.
Oh,
yeah. I mean,
Maritain, that Saint Bernard out of the room.
Yeah. Look, Maritain was a huge influence on me. Same with Bernard Lonergan and Father Norris Clark. I mean, these different Thomists helped me put on a new frame where I began to see, oh, we can make sense of this commitment. We can make sense of that commitment. We can make sense of that commitment, and we can bring it all down. You know, classical theism is reductionist in a sense, but in a very good sense, right? Where the kind of root of reality is infinitely greater than, anything that God creates, right? So that, like in a very basic, almost kindergartenish way, that's kind of maybe just the way to frame it in general, right? Like you're either committed to whatever this natural world is being something that is infinitely less than its ultimate cause, if you will. But if you're a naturalist, it's sort of the reverse. Like whatever is at the root of reality seems infinitely impoverished compared to what's on top, which is us, right? We're pretty amazing. We do awful things, but we're pretty amazing. And I'll tell you what, just from that perspective, I don't know, one just seems a lot easier to believe and swallow.
Yeah, the weight of glory. One thing that I read in graduate school that I found bolstering was a longish essay by Alvin Plantinga, Advice to Christian Philosophers.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, I like that one.
And one of the things that I liked about Plantinga, and I equally liked about Elizabeth Ansco, is the idea that, to put it in the vernacular, Christian thinkers ought not to be such chicken shits.
He's right, yeah. And he wasn't. He wasn't. Yeah.
You've got a lot to say. Say it. Say it.
Yeah, we owe a lot to, great Protestant philosopher, Alvin Plantinga, great contributions to many areas in philosophy and religion, but really a great inspiration to many philosophers to really get into the fray, engage with the best of what contemporary analytic philosophy has to offer, and make sure that Christianity has a seat at the intellectual table. He was really an absolute champion on that front. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
One thing that we didn't talk much, but I think if Maritain were here, he would, is that something that he mentioned, citing Ephesians, I think Ephesians 6, about that what we are wrestling here is not something against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. The role of the devil in human history is not only our freedom, it's not only our reason, it's something else.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so I think it's key in his view. And I think as time passes, I'm more convinced that this is key in what is happening in the church, in the world, in everything.
Oh, I'm with you 100%. I would like to say a few things about that because I think it's so true. And I think Christians should not ignore or be cowardly about bringing forth what's actually in their tradition, right? As explanatory principles, right? If you're a Christian, you should believe that God mediates creation through these principalities, right? That's part of our core commitment. I also would argue that makes great metaphysical sense, right? If you just kind of have the great chain of being, the principle of diffusiveness, like this is sort of what you would expect, right? But if you have that in your kind of wider worldview or intellectual toolkit, I think you can make sense of a lot of different and unfortunately mostly ugly things, right? And speaking of Plantinga gives a sort of famous free will defense where he covers natural evil through demonic activity. Now, a lot of people laugh at that, but I don't think it's anything to laugh at. I actually think that's a very serious proposal if you're a Christian and understand this sort of principle of God's sort of mediated or delegated activity, right? So to me, that those are all resources, not that we should just avail ourselves of to win apologetic debates. I'm not really about that, but to understand what's actually going on in the world, right? I think that we can reach to these higher entities through philosophy, as we've seen many non-Christian philosophers do, even just vaguely. Mortimer Adler is one of these people who always was curious about just angels philosophically, right? But as something that has been revealed to us as well. So yeah, Mario, I'm with you. I can't emphasize that enough. I think that Christians have sort of dropped the ball on that front. Maybe because, and this links to Alvin Plantinga, they're a little afraid of jeers or something like that. Look, there's plenty to jeer at now. If you want to exchange jeers, we can do that all day. There's plenty that makes me chuckle about naturalistic. You want to laugh about angels? I'll laugh about your proposals of emergence, and then we can try and get back to serious philosophy at the end of the day. But yeah, all to say, very much agree with you, Mario. I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. Mm-hmm.
Valerie, please.
I will say something.
Speak to us.
I am thinking about idolatry. I am thinking about the way all of creation and our dimensions of our humanity are like a good that is intended to lead us to and into communion with God, to teach us about God, and how, in a sense, all is icon, right? That the Lord created this experience and this world as a means of coming into relationship with Him and knowing Him and ourselves. But then we get this out of whack where the icons become idols and the means become the ends. And so many goods are rejected because of the experience of this disorder, this idolatry, right? Religion, right? When people are idolatrous sinners in relation to religion, people who do not have faith reject the good of religion because of that experience, right? Of seeing this kind of this cognitive dissonance, but also this kind of the heart is repelled by that, right? So whether it's science, and one of the questions we didn't get to was scientism versus science, and whether it's science or philosophy, we are very good at, or coffee or sex or drugs or, many things that we use to comfort and satisfy ourselves on a superficial level. I just want to throw that out there, idolatry and confusing the means with the ends, and challenging even us who this formulation of ideas and articulation of truth and reason is such a good endeavor. But for a lot of people walking around, they can see that as a distraction. Like, but what are you doing for, your mom who's in that nursing home, or what are you doing for the poor on the street, right? Like, how do these intellectual endeavors, good as they are, can sometimes become, in a sense, idolatrous.
Yeah. Oh, that is such an important point, Valerie. And I know we're getting a little slim on time, but I'll try to offer just a little bit something. I mean, even just to, make sure we're looking in the mirror. I mean, how important it is for Catholics to keep this in mind, to not make any particular aspect of the Catholic faith into God, right? Now, religion, of course, I think is important. I think it's essential, right? Aquinas categorized religion under the virtue of justice. It really is just a sort of linking back to relate to God in the way that God has invited us to relate to him, right? And particularly by joining this moral community where we can receive our Lord in the Eucharist. I mean, what an incredible gift, right? But how important it is to, make sure that we're not making, like you said, idols of certain, practices or expression. Not to say any of that is important, because they obviously are important in what they're supposed to facilitate. But if we make them the end itself, we succumb to exactly the error that you're talking about, right? So I don't know if I have anything particularly profound to offer about that, aside from just a reminder that it is such an important point, right? And that really, religion and relationship with God are obviously not incompatible. Sometimes you hear that in modern. I don't need religion. I've got a relationship with God. Well, did you ask God how he wants to have that relationship, right? It seems like an important question, right? And of course, the Catholic is going to say that's been specified. That's been specified. And if so, right, then under that category of justice, that's exactly how we should relate to God. Why? Because he knows that is what is ultimately the best for us. But to keep that global perspective in mind, I think is absolutely essential.
Perfect. Thank you.
I think it's time to come to the end. I want to just preface our reading from the Gospel by reflecting that we should be praying for peace in the Middle East and peace in Ukraine. Today's Gospel is from Luke. The Lord said, "Woe to you, Pharisees! You pay tithes of mint, of rue, and of every garden herb, but you pay no attention to judgment and to love for God. These you should have done without overlooking the others. Woe to you, Pharisees! You love the seat of honor in synagogues and greetings in marketplaces. Woe to you! You are like unseen graves over which people unknowingly walk." Then one of the scholars of the law said to him in reply, "Teacher, by saying this, you are insulting us too." And he said, "Woe also to you, scholars of the law! You impose on people burdens hard to carry, but you yourselves do not lift one finger to touch them. Come, Lord Jesus, come."
Amen.
Thank you.
Amen.
Thanks to all.
Thank you.
Thank you
Very
all
good.
very much.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.